Hello, this is Neil Buchanan with Rock Our World. I'm going to, in my high-tech studio here, I'm going to replay sounds like a radio interview off of YouTube. It's about an hour, so I'm going to put it on 2 episodes, and then in a third one, I'll come back and make comments about it. But it's what I would describe as 2 sane people. One of them is the author of a book called Planet X, and perhaps the same one I read 20 years ago. Or the same author, I don't know, but anyway, it's spoken in such a way that it's more believable than some of the things you see on YouTube. I've said this before, you have to glean, ask God to help you to glean through what's on YouTube. Maybe 20% of it is accurate, but you will not find truth in the media or from the government. So we got some big things happening on Earth coming up in a few months, and best to prepare as best we can. So here goes.
Don Rumsfeld announced at a Pentagon news conference that the agency was 2.2 trillion short. Money was simply missing, 2.2, not billion, but trillion. So having worked for a period of time at the Pentagon, I realized this was most likely black budget funds. And I did some investigation, and I ran across a couple of areas, basically the deep underground military base research done by Jesse Ventura, done by Phil Schneider, done by other personalities. And I realized, of course, that's likely the source of the lost money. It's black budget ops, and it's being spent. And why is it being spent in terms of these type of bases? So that's how my curiosity was picked, you might say. These bases, I understand, are built away primarily from geologic tectonic areas. But again, when Planet X passes, you're going to have new geotectonic faults established when you have force 11, 12, 13, 14 earthquakes. So I don't know how safe they're going to be. It could be a lost investment for those people. In any case, that was my basic introduction about 5 years ago. And then I got into the science of the topic.
Well, and science is something that I'd really like to get into today, so we could help the skeptics see some solid evidence to help them prepare, mentally, physically, spiritually, whatever. It sounds like it's going to be difficult in many cases to prepare for this type of event if it is as serious as many predict. Different underground bases. They've been building them for years. You can go all the way back 70 years, and they were building these things, probably even before that. So have they been spending more money since 2001 on these underground bases then?
My understanding, and this is partly from Phil Schneider, I know he worked 11 years at Groom Lake Area 51. He says the black budget varies between 0.2 trillion and 1.2 trillion per year. I'm not sure when the inception started. It was absolutely going on in the late 70s and 80s. He says a couple of dozen of these may be reasonable for protection. I agree, nuclear protection. But the question is, why do we have over 130 of these? That doesn't really make any sense unless, obviously, Planet X is absolutely a fact, which it is.
Well, so, 4 years ago, I remember reading an article on Yahoo News that claimed eventually people are going to be able to look up in the sky and they're going to see what looks like a second sun, but really it's a giant sun that exploded. I think they said it was Betelgeuse or something like that. So in my mind, when I read stuff like that in the news, I think it's, the forces behind the scenes or whoever's kind of orchestrating the media prepping people, subconsciously getting them ready for this type of event. First, it's just an explosion that looks like a sun, and then, hey, oh, it is a sun. So, do you have any physical evidence, like pictures that you can say without a shadow of a doubt, or files or white papers?
Yes, I do. In fact, there's some very good videos on the internet itself that are good photographic analysis. There's one called Multiple Suns Rise Over Halifax, Nova Scotia. Those are the keywords that a person would enter on YouTube to read it or view it. And you can see the sun. And then at the 3 o'clock position, you have planet X. To the right of planet X, you have a separate lens flare. Now, that doesn't reflect the lens flare, of course, in the water below, but planet X is generating its own light, and you can see its reflection, therefore, in the water below. Next, I think a fog bank moves in, and it obscures the sun, but planet X is still visible. A lens flare cannot do this. Now, that's one good example of something they could simply look up themselves on YouTube. There's also some good Davis Station South Pole videos out there. And there's, in my book, which is Planet X, The Arrival in 2017 by David Meade on Amazon, I've done a video. It's on page 15 or 16 or so of the book. And I have a section called Photographic Analysis of Planet X. And I study one video which another analyst did an extensive study on. And let me just sort of explain what happened. A fellow named Glenn Vaughn on April 11th, 2015, was flying down the Pacific side of Central America. He's a professor, an ex-professor at California University. He took a 20 megapixel raw file with a Sony digital camera, and he confirmed the report by sending it in to a particular analyst for review. He took it through an aircraft window. Now, an analysis of the metadata indicated it was taken at 240 dpi, very high resolution, and the metadata further showed the date, the time, the GPS coordinates. I think it was a Sony DSC HX50V camera. In any case, using Starry Night Professional version, the video, which is referenced in my book and which is on YouTube, did a field of view analysis, and he determined Mercury is above, in other words, superior conjunction with the sun, and the object in the field of view, therefore, is not Mercury. Mercury does not have wings, as does this object, and Mercury does not have the brightness or contrast of the unknown object. Now, the analyst also performed a gamma test on a paint program. Gamma testing shows if an object is hot or cold. Hot objects generate, of course, their own light like our sun. A lens flare would be a cold object. They redirect light, they don't generate it. So he started with a gamma of 1, reducing it by steps. At point 10, the gamma illustrates stark differences. At point 01, he shows the hottest, brightest objects on the video. He then reduced brightness to a value, I think, of -3 in contrast to +2. The hot objects fade in together, proving they're genuine. Then he ran a luminance test to determine the intensity of the object, and he determined it was behind the sun, not a reflection. There are actually wings on the object, which is clearly behind the sun. Now, he stated this is deeply disturbing. The reason is that gas tails of comets follow solar winds, and they're not visible until the comet's orbit is inside of Jupiter, at which point, normally the luminosity at that point of the sun makes the tails of the comet or the planet visible. Of course, planet X, we all call it planet X or Nibiru, but it is a dwarf star. It's either a red dwarf or brown dwarf star. Now, the object, which is clearly planet X by deductive logic and process elimination, is therefore now between Mars and Jupiter. It's not in the outer reaches of the solar system. It can clearly be seen, especially from the southern hemisphere. Now, as of April 2015, therefore, the date of that video and the analysis, Nibiru is close enough to the sun so that the sun's light is reflected to the tail, making it appearing like wings. And there's one other quick comment I'd make, because actually that video had 2 parts. The second part was a lady who lives near where I do, Sanibel Island, Florida, Melissa Huffman. Now, you can look at this video itself on YouTube. I think it has more or less gone viral, and nearly 1 million people have looked at it. And this is a 2015 video. The object is very interesting. She pans the sky and shows the object and then the moon. Now, it's clearly a planet visible just north of the sun. Now, using stellarium and knowing the moon phases, comparing it to her video on the moon, you can go to the derived date, take away the atmosphere and the ocean, and you can determine the relationship of the stars to the horizon. So to determine the date, you basically just use moon charts. And the moon is well below the horizon in all dates after September 26, 2015. Therefore, the video was taken earlier. Now, September 2015 moon phases give us a comparable to the moon in the video. And if you look at the moon phases diagram to the actual picture of the moon, it has to have been photographed on September 23rd, 2015, based on moon phasing. Now, on that date, Mercury in stellarium is very dim, somewhat above the horizon. also, I believe it's in a different location than the unknown object. All other planets are below the horizon. The video, therefore, conclusively and plainly shows an unidentified planet, or dwarf star, planet X, of some significant magnitude quite clearly. So I can reach no other conclusion, and the analyst did himself, than this is a rare photo from this hemisphere of planet X approaching us.
Wow. You know, and there's also speculation now, and I hadn't heard this until about a year ago, that not only is Planet X going to come our way, this dwarf star, but also a bunch of planets with it, like it's bringing in its own solar system. Is there evidence or truth to that?
Right. There's a number of videos there. I've seen some real good ones from the South Pole Telescope, and they indicate that there are a variety of moons around this. It's basically, as you say, it's its own solar system. A lot of people don't realize this, but binary, what we've got in our solar system here is obviously a binary twin. 76%, this is a fact, of all stars are binary twins. In fact, 16% are trinary twins. There are three suns, but ours has a binary companion, and it comes under the name of Planet X, Nibiru, and so forth, Nemesis. There are various names to it. But ours has a binary twin, and it's very common. It's extremely common, and it's basically what is approaching us. And apparently, from all descriptions, indications, reports, insider reports, photographs, and other sources of human and signal intelligence, it contains 5 to 7 moons around it. So it's a solar system approaching our solar system, which makes it extremely dangerous.
You know, even the most recent Star Trek movie that came out, they portrayed Nibiru in this movie, and the inhabitants of the planet were primitive. You know, they were almost like Amazon-like tribal, what you would think of from many years ago. It's just interesting how they've really kind of pushed it into the media. But from the skeptic standpoint, you can go back to 2003. And in 2003, supposedly Nibiru was supposed to come by the Earth and wipe everybody out. And then it didn't happen. And then it was supposed to be 2012. And one thing that I find interesting, and I'm not a religious person, but I definitely think there's a lot of correlations in the Bible, especially if you read Revelations and things that are going on today. Whether it's a playbook for these people or it's just prophecy, which it very well could be, you know, it talks about how nobody really knows the time when basically shit hits the fan. And with all of this crying wolf for 10, 20 years before something like that happens, I can see how the population can become really docile, you know, because they've heard it before so many times. So when it really does happen, it's almost like unbelievable.
Right. There's a lot of disinformation out there, and you have to consider the sources of the disinformation. Obviously, I have a feeling when people join Congress nowadays, whether they join as a senator or at the lower level, that they have a visit from a higher up or from their local NSA agent pretty quick on, and they say, you know, you're going to find out some things that we don't want you to talk about. And if you don't talk about them, guess what? We're going to give you a seat in an apartment at an underground base when this all happens. And so you don't really have anything at all. You have a complete, you know, blackout of news from the so-called authorities of Washington, D.C. But again, what do you expect? You have to consider the source. Now, there's been a lot of Google and NASA cover-up, in my opinion, on this. And I'll give you an example of it real quick that might sort of answer your question and also even move us a little bit into a combination of astronomy and the Apocalypse, the book of Revelation, the last book of the Bible. So there's an object I call the Red Dragon Anomaly, which appears in the constellation Virgo. And it currently, very interestingly, mirrors the vision or biblical sign of Revelation chapter 12. Now, this is a critical, major sign. Of course, Revelation is from the highest authority, Revelation 1. John wrote it on the Isle of Patmos about 2,000 years ago. And in it, he found out that cosmologically the sun travels the ecliptic, and every September it passes through the constellation Virgo. The moon also travels close by. Now, towards the end of September in 2017 next year, there is a precise configuration of the Revelation 12 imagery. And I've used stellarium, and I've gone back 6,000 years, and I've gone forward 1,000 years. And it's complex and involves the simultaneous interface of half a dozen astronomical variables, but it only occurs once, and that's in September of 2017, a year and a half from now. But in addition to the Revelation 12 sign as it's known, the imagery of the dragon at the feet of Virgo with the sun at the head and the moon at the feet presents itself right now, very interestingly, in Starry Night in real time. Now, this is highly unusual and extraordinary. The red dragon of Revelation 12 may well be, and I believe rather obviously is, Planet X, as is referred to in an earlier chapter of Revelation, I think Revelation chapter 8, in a similar manner. A colleague of mine at the university, one university in the western U.S., brought up a very interesting point, perhaps to cover up to my intention. Here it is. Basically, he said, the areas of the dragon anomaly have been covered or patched up by Google Sky in the past. But one of the ways to actually see what is behind this patched out area is to use a program called Skyview by NASA. Skyview, what that is, it's a virtual observatory on the net. It generates images of any part of the sky from wavelengths of all regimes, radio to gamma. You just filter it. Now, when you view these images in various filters, you can see the actual color of this anomaly in Virgo is red, and it does look very menacing, as it appears to have a face like a dragon with two profound eyes. It's very intriguing and quite strange. Now, just for your listeners, I'll provide very briefly the right ascension and declination if they want to go to Skyview. And here it is. Just cut and paste this coordinate. Here's the right ascension, 13 hours, 50 minutes, 44 seconds. Here's the declination, and that would be minus 8 hours, 13 minutes and 59.7 seconds. So right ascension is the celestial equivalent of longitude, and in the sky, latitude is called declination. So you just enter those coordinates, and then on Skyview, you just choose the Iris 100 micron telescope setting, and there you are. You've never seen an object quite like this one. Now, the sign itself might be a sweeping parenthetic of that entire biblical 70th week of Daniel, which is a key to solving the most complex cryptogram in existence, the book of the Apocalypse. As to what it is, the astronomical scientific community, I think, is keeping a very low profile. And the question is, why did they ever cover it up to begin with?
And not only that, if we could get into some of the more scientific stuff as well that you talked about, that you put together, is in your opinion, the Great Flood that's talked about and has been talked about all over the world in other mythos as well. Do you feel that that was caused by this orbital, from Nibiru coming back many years ago, getting close to the Earth and caused some type of giant tidal waves and stuff and earthquakes?
Well, it indeed could have. I'm not positive of the exact date in biblical history of Noah's flood. I think it was close to 4,000 years ago, might have been a little bit more. Very good question. Now, in fact, what that question leads us into is the main item we have historically in terms of archaeology to help us relate on a scientific basis to a prior pole shift by the Earth is something called the Nebra Sky Disk. Now, this is a 12-inch bronze disk, the Nebra Sky Disk. It may be the key to determining the last recorded time in history that Planet X actually flew by the Earth. The disk is bronze. It's inlaid with gold. It was found near Europe's oldest observatory in Gossig, Germany. Now, the story of the disk is quite unconventional. It was found, I think, in 1999, by German treasure hunters, and they were using metal detectors inside an ancient forest. However, German law dictates that all such relics are state property. So instead of turning it in, they attempted to sell it on the international market a couple of years later in 2002. Now, working for the Swiss government, an archaeologist named Harold Meller, I believe, posed as a straw buyer. The disc was seized by authorities, and then it was analyzed. Now, what it contains symbols, including the sun, the moon, the constellations, I think, of Pleiades, Capricorn, Piraeus, and Gemini. Now, the disc reflects the sun in the position of a solar eclipse. What is causing the eclipse? Well, it's not the moon, which is on the opposite side of where it should be located. So I think the best deductive logic is that an unknown near-Earth object is causing the eclipse. Now, this 32-centimeter disc weighs about 2 kilograms. Again, it's decorated with gold leaf symbols, and the gold leaf symbols also reflect 4 planets: Venus, Mars, I believe Jupiter and Mercury. Now, using modern-day astronomical software, you can plot the actual day and hour the disk was produced, and the result is very precise. It was produced at April 6, 1810 BCE at 8:30 a.m. The disk was thus created during the Bronze Age, which is 3,826 years ago. Now, there's a curved bar at the bottom of the riverbank, the Saul River, which still currently exists. Much of the disk's current coloration is green due to a tarnishing effect. And the discovery site is a prehistoric enclosure in the Ziegelrodes Forest, known by the name of Middleburg or Central Hill, 60 kilometers, I believe, west of Leipzig. Now, the treasure hunters stated it was found within a pit in the forest near the ancient Gothic observatory. Now, here's something extremely interesting. Upon examination, the disk reflects the constellation Orion at the very bottom. Orion should not have been observable from that location in Germany at that time. The nearest location, in fact, from which the constellation Orion, could have been observed is Luxor, Egypt. That adds to the mystery. The only logical conclusion is that this 26 to 30 degree difference is accounted for by a simultaneous pole shift. So this mystery-shrouded sky disk of Nebra is an advanced astronomical clock. It's a compendium of knowledge. And I think it gives us the best proof of the existence and passage of Planet X in the ancient world. So the purpose of the sky disk is really no longer a matter of speculation. I believe, and others believe, it's the oldest visual representation of the sky in existence. And it postulates and proves the approach of a near-Earth object causing the daytime eclipse, as well as causing a major pole shift that has just occurred, and that was 3,826 years ago.
And have you heard of the Sumerian tablets?
Yes, I have. They were analyzed by a fellow named Zechariah Sitchin, who wrote a book called The 12th Planet back around 1970, 75, I believe it was.
The stuff he talks about in his books as well, when he deciphers the tablets or translates them, he talks about Planet X and Nibiru, the winged destroyer, and basically a 3,600-year orbital pattern, or orbital cycle. So it's been talked about for forever, basically. Previous generations, and it sounds to me like we're getting pretty close to where if you've got a pretty good telescope and you know where to look, you can go outside, look up in the sky, and you can see it for yourself.
That is correct. Now, when it was first observed, however, back in the 80s, because it's so close now, it's different. When it was first observed, probably the first time it was actually observed, it was observed in the infrared spectrum in 1983 by a orbiting Earth satellite telescope called the Infrared Astronomical Satellite. And this is when all those articles appeared in the Washington Post and the New York Times and so forth. And that's when, right before blackout occurred, there were some articles over a 6 to 12 month period of time when it was pretty much spoken freely of. And then all of a sudden, I think they realized the seriousness of the matter, and they went ahead and produced a blackout. But a lot of times I think many of the instruments that are used to view this object in very great detail are, for example, the Spitzer telescope, which is in a trailing Earth orbit. It's, of course, a satellite telescope, and it's infrared. And the Vatican, they've got their telescope, and that's infrared also. That's in Mount Graham in southeastern Arizona on the top of a 10,000-foot mountain. It has several names to it. One code name, they've actually got several telescopes there. They've got a radio telescope. They're listening for extraterrestrial intelligence. And then they've got the VATT telescope, and then they're also joint venturing a project that they strangely have codenamed, of all names, Lucifer. And
right.
This is can you believe it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, right now, the world we live in, it's to be expected. Well, it's unbelievable.
It's right, it is. And Father Malachi Martin, I remember an interview with him back some years ago. I found out about it later, but he interviewed, I think, with Art Bell or some radio show in 1997, and he said, we're looking for an object, we the Vatican. Now, he was a Vatican insider. He's an ex-Jesuit. He was a Jesuit. And he said, we're looking for an object that's approaching from space. The Catholic Church is, the Vatican is, and we think it's going to approach in about 20 years. Now, that was in 1997, which is 19 years ago. So he basically, I believe he was a professor of paleontology at the Pontifical Biblical Institute of the Vatican, and he criticized the Vatican for not releasing the full content of the third secret of Fatima. Presumption was the Vatican didn't want the facts known about wormwood. Well, in any case, it just seems highly suspicious that they've invested, all of this money there to. Why are they in the strange business of astronomy? Why do they have this large binocular telescope on Mount Graham? It's a near-infrared telescope. Now, the cover story is, of course, they're looking for extrasolar planets and alien intelligence. But they have an infrared telescope. They have to supercool it to minus 351 Fahrenheit to allow it to conduct observations. And, of course, a dwarf star, whether it's a red dwarf or a brown dwarf, and the only difference is size in those. Brown dwarf never reached fusion stage. It didn't convert hydrogen to helium. A red dwarf is anywhere from 0.8% to half the size of our sun. Anything less than 8% of the size of our sun is classified as a brown dwarf. So it's one of the two. But the way to observe those is in the infrared spectrum. They do have red halos around them. But to determine the heat signature, you need an infrared telescope. So that's what you've got. And anyway, I think another Vatican insider stated that the Graham Observatory is used to study anomalous celestial bodies approaching the Earth. And I think in an interview with him, he compared it to what the CIA did with one of its secret eyes known as the twin to Hubble's Kio 12, you may have heard of that program. But in any case, the Vatican is set up like a government. It has its own secret intelligence agency. It's called the SIV, and the English translation is the Information Service of the Vatican. And the LBT, their Lucifer telescope, is two giant 28-foot diameter telescope mirrors, and it's super cooled in order to observe near-infrared wavelength range. So the question is, what do you think they're looking for?
It's interesting, too, because you brought up the way that a brown dwarf and a red dwarf works, and you talk about how it's very difficult to see unless you've got, this infrared type telescope or whatever. And I've seen so many different pictures of what could be Nibiru or some type of other anomaly, but there's a few pictures I'm thinking of in particular. And the last show I did on Nibiru a few weeks ago with a gentleman by the name of Bob Evans.
So this is a good spot to pause. So I'm going to make a break in this presentation, and we're going to listen to the rest of this interview in a part 2, and then I'll come back in a part 3, and I think they would be episode 76, 77, and 78. So I'll sign out. This is Rock Our World with Neil Buchanan, and it's interesting that we have this huge rock, a dwarf star apparently, coming towards us, and it's definitely going to rock our world. But the Lord will look after us, and I will explain the importance of, as this man said, putting your spiritual life in order and putting your trust in the Lord rather than trying to save yourself, though there's physical things we can do. But I'll talk about all these things. So we'll talk to you soon in the next episode in part 2 of this interview.